That's Sheila. I'm Eric. We're going to talk about myths of the Civil War, things that we hear every day. Some of it might be a little lighthearted, but most of it's serious because we really think that myths obscure fact, and the most important thing are the facts. That's how you get to the truth. That's how you get a better understanding of what happened, not just in the 1860s, but before that and after that. One of the myths that we hear focuses on someone who was here at the Battle of Franklin. That's John Bell Hood. You know, we still hear about how John Bell Hood was either a dummy, didn't know what he was doing, but that he was addicted to morphine. The truth is, there's no evidence of that at all. Another one of the big myths that we certainly hear, if not every day, we hear still several times a week, is what was the cause of the Civil War, and it was nothing to do with slavery. It was about states' rights, and there's all these little tentacles that attach to it. But I think that if you look at the facts, there's no doubt that it's the politics of slavery that leads to secession. In fact, you really have to agree that secession is what leads to the Civil War, but what's the cause of secession but the politics of slavery? And as we often say, if you want to say it's states' rights, well, you know, it is. It's the state's right to either own slaves or not, and it's only slaveholding states that secede.
And they're pretty direct about why they're seceding, and they spell that out in their declarations of secession. Now, the reason that the United States goes into that war, the reason that Lincoln will prosecute the war is not slavery, not in the beginning. He's trying to hold the Union together, but of course, as the war evolves, he will redefine with the Emancipation Proclamation, and then it becomes very clearly their objective as well.
So then the other myth is that Lincoln didn't care about slavery, when the truth is he's been talking about it for years.
The fact that Lincoln is a statesman and that he is willing to make political concessions to try to hold the Union together, I think, prompts people sometimes to make that observation. The fact that he was willing to allow slavery to continue if those states came back into the Union, they point to that and say, see, he didn't care about slavery at all. What? But you have to ignore everything he said in the years leading up to that to draw a conclusion like that.
So another one that we hear a lot about is how many young soldiers there were. That there were all these boys who were 13 and 14 and 15 years old, and the evidence is just exactly the opposite. Were there teenagers, young teenagers? Yes, there were, but the average age of a Civil War soldier was in his early 20s on both sides. I don't know how that's become so entrenched, but it's like people have seen that Johnny Clem, image, the little 10 or 12-year-old
I think they
kid.
like to attach to that because it makes for a good story.
Right.
Look how dedicated they were to the cause. They would run off at 14.
Right. It's not the norm.
Exception.
Right. That's a really, really pervasive myth. In fact, if you look at the ranks of soldiers, you have men who really run the gamut pretty consistently from about 18 to 35.
Well, and we even have a situation here at Franklin when there's a father and his sons that are both fighting in the war, right? So you even have 40, 50-year-olds sometimes. Here at Carnton, a lot of the myths that we hear are related to medicine because this house, of course, was a field hospital, and one of the pervasive myths is that soldiers endured surgery without any type of anesthesia. And that's just not true. In 95% of all Civil War surgeries, they're using anesthesia, chloroform primarily.
There aren't a lot of sites in America like Carnton where you can actually visit a Civil War field hospital. Whether it's Gone with the Wind or North and South, even at the beginning of the movie Glory, which is a really solid movie when Robert Gould Shaw's like getting some little shrapnel pulled out of his neck. In the background, you can see the saw and the guy is screaming. For every person we reach, that movie reaches 100,000 times more, and so you've just got to keep chipping away.
Chloroform had a unique effect on the body in that sometimes it would cause the muscles to seize up after it's applied. You're already unconscious, you're not feeling anything, but the body would have a reaction where it would tremor or shake, and so the patient had to be held down, not because they were struggling, but because they were having this involuntary reaction. So I think sometimes people look at something like that and it just, they tell stories based on that or whatever.
And if you look at survival rates, soldiers were surviving in large numbers at field hospitals because they were sedated. They didn't go into utter shock, have a heart attack because of the trauma.
Another one of those myths that we get asked about a lot here is that whole idea of tossing limbs out the window.
Oh, goodness, yeah.
Is disgusting to begin with. And to think about a medical professional who has dedicated his life to taking care of the human body, just flinging recklessly limbs out the window seems unconscionable to begin with. And certainly here at Carnton, you've been on that second floor tossing anything out the window. You're hitting people in the head. There are 300 wounded men out there in that yard.
One of the stories I heard early on was how the limbs were piled as high as the smokehouse. Well, if you've never been here before, the smokehouse is like 15 feet from the ground to the peak. There'd be more limbs out there than there were soldiers that were ever here. The reality was bad enough. We don't have to make it into something it's not, and I think that probably leads into another myth. Well, maybe it's not a myth. It is sort of a really wildly popular practice in its ghost tours. We don't do ghost tours at Carnton or Carter House. There used to be in years past, but they haven't been done for a long time. And ghost tours are big business. But the truth is that so much of what is said is just patently false. We've taken the approach that at a place like Carnton, Carter House, or just the battlefield, when you have a place where, first of all, slavery existed for decades, and then you have a battlefield where death and destruction was rampant, when people are talking about hearing a whisper or hearing a voice, frankly, I don't think a lot of people would actually want to hear what went on at a place like this. I don't think ghost tours are any more appropriate here than they are at Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan, or jumping around looking for paranormal activity at Pearl Harbor. I just think that there are certain places that are best to be left alone.
We hear this a lot more interestingly on our Facebook posts, I think, but we get comments from folks who are defensive of their ancestors, and they will say, my ancestors didn't own slaves. This wasn't about slavery. Most of the people who were fighting for the Confederate cause didn't own slaves. And they'll cite, only 2%, 3% of Southerners actually owned slaves.
It's true. Most Southern soldiers, most Confederate soldiers did not own slaves. But the idea that only 5% of white Southerners owned slaves, that itself is a myth, because the actual number is more like in the mid-teens. And it varies state to state. Percentages of slave ownership in Mississippi versus Tennessee, it's almost 2-to-1 difference. But overall, about 15% of white Southerners own slaves. But see, that's only the tip of the iceberg. When you think about that number, most slave owners are married. Most slave owners, like everybody else, has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children. So in some of the states, you're looking at 50% plus. At a bare minimum, 35, 40% of the white Southern population is directly connected to slavery. And an example of that is right here at Carnton. There are 5 white people living here in 1860.
One of those is a slave owner.
Well, 2. Carrie owned slaves.
Slave owner.
But still 5 people, 2 slave owners. All 5 are directly connected, but the 3 don't get counted as slave owners. So you could go to the Carter House. Fountain Branch Carter in 1860 owns 28 slaves. There's a bunch of people there that don't, but he does. And many Confederate soldiers didn't own slaves, but their fathers did. Robert Capel, who's buried right here at Carnton, his father owned 90 plus slaves in Mississippi. Robert didn't own any, but Robert was right. Because when his father Eli died, Robert would almost certainly would have inherited some, if not all, of the slaves.
And as a side issue, if you're looking at soldiers specifically, the number of soldiers that are slave owners might be smaller, because if you owned 20 slaves, you didn't have to fight. That was one of the policies of the Confederacy.
I think one of the interesting myths about the North in agriculture is that the North was all just a bunch of big city Yankees. Well, gosh, once you got west of Pennsylvania, there wasn't much but rural country, and frankly, half or 2/3 of the U.S. Army were filled with poor white farmers, just like the Southern Army. Of course, on the U.S. side, you end up with 180,000 black troops in the second half of the war, and that maybe feeds the myth that this really wasn't about slavery. It's just poor whites fighting poor whites. Oh, how about most Confederate soldiers were ill-clothed and barefoot? It was a big problem. But Southerners, in many ways, were outfitted, even in 1864, both with weapons and clothing, in much better fashion than a lot of people would consider. In fact, Hood's army has received a substantial cache of shoes and socks and pants and jackets and shirts as they were coming up into Tennessee. And on the other side, although the U.S. Army was always more well-equipped, boy, your shoes and jacket and such can wear out when you're out in the field for 6 or 9 months, and I mean literally out in the field, where your clothes are starting to rot off of you. It's a bad situation on both sides. Nobody's really eating well. Northerners probably always ate a little better, but soggy, gross hardtack filled with worms versus eating acorns and raw cornmeal, neither one's really palatable as far as I'm concerned.
Which is part of what makes it easy for us to Monday morning quarterback a battle or a decision made by a military advisor when we're not having to make that under the conditions that they were dealing with. They're tired and they're hungry.
Well, they should have done this and they should have done that. If only they'd done this.
Well, that's easy when you're sitting at your keyboard, or you're at a Civil War roundtable, or even at a Civil War site, just kind of going back and forth with the tour guide and the guests, and you've had a good meal, you haven't had dysentery, you haven't been shot at, you're not scared, you're not hot, you're not cold, you haven't been away from home for 2 or 3 years. We feel it's important to do is to educate, is to always try to get the facts out there, and sometimes that means challenging how people have viewed a subject, but the path to growth and understanding is sometimes having to change your mind and adjust. does.
And if new information makes you uncomfortable, rather than putting up a defense, take a minute to look at it and examine the evidence and see if maybe there is a more factual way of understanding. Thanks for watching, folks.